I want to talk about a sensitive subject today and tomorrow. I hope I'll finish talking about it. And I want to introduce it by a famous problem that Plato expressed called the Euthyphro problem. I'm not a Plato scholar, and I'm pretending to do Plato scholarship. I'm taking what he said and how it's been used for 2,300 years and using it to launch a problem from the point of view of the Torah's view of the world. In their worldview, there are gods, and the gods have rules specifically for how human beings should behave, and there's an understanding of goodness and justice and so forth and so on. And the assumption, as Plato sees it, the assumption in Greek thinking is that rules that are good, right, just, moral, ethical, appropriate are, in fact, identical to what the gods want people to do. The good, the right, and the just are, in fact, what the gods want people to do. When the gods give rules, that's what they're supposed to be expressing. So these two are the same. What the gods want and the good, the right, and the ethical are the same. Now he asks, which depends upon which? How did it develop? Is it that the good is the good, and the right is the right, and the just is the just, and that's absolute, and it's somehow written in stone, and it gets its justification externally, and the gods want the good, and the right, and the just, and the appropriate, the moral, the ethical. Maybe because the gods themselves are moral and ethical. Good and right and just are independent, and the gods certify that that's what they want. That's one possibility. Or the other possibility is the gods want what they want, and because they want it, that's what makes them right and good and just and moral and ethical. It's the gods wanting them, the gods commanding them, the gods being on record that this is what they are demanding, that is the basis for its being good and right and ethical and all the rest. Which precedes which? Is it that the gods follow the goodness and rightness of the rules and certify it because they too want to participate in what's good and right? So the goodness and rightness of the rules comes first, independent, stands on its own, chiseled in stone, and they just react to that by picking it up and certifying it? Or are the gods the source? The gods are gods, they're not human, they're above our world, and they have their desires and their goals and their judgments and their pronouncements. And then when they take a position on something, their taking the position makes it good and right and binding and ethical and moral. Now, whenever someone says, is it this way or that way, in the back of your mind, you ought to be thinking, are those the only two alternatives? I'm not going to go into that right now. We'll get to that sometime later. Now, that's Plato talking for the ancient Greek population. I think if I would put Plato's question in modern terms, I would put it in terms of Jewish thought, Jewish practice, I think that there would be a chorus of agreement which way it goes. Is it that it's wrong to steal, and it's wrong to kill, and it's right to give charity, and it's right to pursue justice, and those are things which bind an atheist, and you don't have to know anything about creation to understand them. Their basis is something which is standing independently of all religion. And God, being the supreme moral being, of course, signs on to that morality and gives it makes it his project that we should live that way. That's one possibility. Or the opposite. God says what he says. and he commands what he commands, and his saying so and his commanding it make it right. It isn't right or good independently of God. On the contrary, it's his will and it's his command that give it its rightness, without which it wouldn't have the rightness. I think it was Dostoevsky who was supposed to have expressed this in great literary form. He said, if there is no God, everything is permitted. Well, he didn't do a good job, because permitted is also a moral term. So what he meant to say is, if there is no God, there's no morality at all. God creates morality. Without God, there's no morality. Now, I think that if I put those two alternatives, there's a certain vagueness in what I'm saying, but I can't do everything all at once. If I put those two alternatives, most people, maybe the vast majority, would say, of course, God creates morality. He makes it. When he says so, it becomes, he says do it, it becomes good. If he says don't do it, it becomes bad. Without God, there can't be morality. There's no standard. Nothing can make it right. Nothing can determine it. It's all subjective. Not really morality unless God makes it so. Now, the difficulty is that both alternatives have problems. They have intuitive problems. Maybe the problems won't bother you. Maybe they just ride roughshod and say, okay, well, it's just wrong. But intuitively, if you're trying to appeal to my understanding and convince me that there's some basis for what's being said, both sides suffer problems. If you say that God's will, God's command, makes things right and makes things wrong, because he's infinite, because he's transcendent, because whatever, then you have to ask yourself, what would happen if God commanded things which intuitively are wrong? Suppose God commanded murder. Suppose God commanded torturing until death. Suppose God commanded that everyone should commit suicide. Would that make them right? Would that make them morally right? Morally good because God said so? You could say yes. It's an easy syllable to pronounce. But if you want to base it on something, if you want to convince somebody of something, there's going to be an obstacle here. What do you mean? If God said so, it would make murder right. Wouldn't you be tempted to ask, what kind of God is that who says that you should murder people? Would you want to question him and his validity if he said something like that? So if you say that God's will and God's command create morality, without God there's no morality at all, which is what Dostoevsky meant to say, what he should have said is not everything's permitted, because again, permitted is a moral term, it's moral judgment. What he should have said is, without God, nothing is forbidden, nothing is required, there are no rules. That would mean that when God makes the rules, whatever they are, become morally binding. And that's hard to swallow. On the other hand, if you say that the moral rules have their validity somewhere else independently, and that God then simply tells us what to do, and he follows the laws of independent morality when he tells us what to do, then it turns out that God has no moral authority other than he may know the rules better than we do, and he may know the circumstances better than we do, but he has no input into making things right and wrong. That also seems odd, because somehow God's infinity and God's transcendence should seem to give him some kind of special leverage with respect to morality, just like it is with respect to the creation and the laws of the physical laws of the universe, that there shouldn't be something totally outside of him that determines the thing being right. So both answers have intuitive barriers, and something which, it's a good thing to struggle with, I think. And I don't know that in secular philosophy there's an agreed upon answer. Of course, it's not our context anymore. It's in a hypothetical society. But I'm inclined to think that there's a third option. And I think that's why the problem seems to be so difficult to answer, because they're only considering two options, and there's really a third option. Now, I'm absolutely convinced I found this in John Stuart Mill. I can even quote what he said. I just can't Google it. I can't find it. So, am I wrong? Maybe. But I do remember his saying it. I'll tell you what I think the answer is abstractly. I'll tell you how he used it, and then I'll go back through and show you how it works in detail, word for word. It's a hybrid. The truth is a hybrid. There are moral rules which have independent moral standing. They aren't made right because God commanded them. They aren't made right because God willed them. They are right for some other reason, some other independent reason, and maybe we'll talk about that. But some moral rules, when they apply to people's actions, give moral authority to those people because of their actions, so that later they can say, I want you to do X. When they say, I want you to do X, you're morally bound to do it. And if they had said, I want you to do Y, you'd be morally bound to do that. So it's a hybrid situation, starting from the bottom. George says, I want you to do X, and I say, George told me he wants me to do it. I've got to do it. Why? Because there's a moral rule that says when people do Q, they get moral authority. And he did Q. So that rule tells me that he now has the authority to tell me what to do. So it's not freestanding authority, it's interacting with a prior moral rule. Let me give you some examples so that you can see a little bit how this works. Fred is drowning in the river. And George jumps in to some danger to himself and saves his life. Fred says to George, you saved my life. Fred, George, if you need something, just call me. I owe you my life. Well, if ever I can do something for you, just let me know what you want. I'll be happy to do it. 3 weeks later, George calls Fred and says, hello, this is George. Remember me? Remember you? You saved my life. Of course I remember you. I need help Sunday afternoon painting my living room purple. Whatever you say, George. Purple it is. When he gets there, he says, you know something? I've given up on the purple. I need to balance my checkbook. Sure, balance your checkbook. Whatever you want, George. But you see, because George saved Fred's life. When somebody does you a great benefit, morally speaking, you owe him something. What do you owe him? Well, something. You know, some kind of service that he wants. Some kind of service that will benefit him somehow. Which one? Whichever one he says. It's not specific. Of course, there's limits. If he tells you what I'd like you to do is jump off a building and commit suicide, that you don't owe. But the difference between painting his living room purple and balancing his checkbook, if it's within the amount of effort and time that you owe him, whatever it is, it becomes something which it becomes morally binding. The principle of gratitude says someone who benefits you creates a moral debt, and then when he expresses his need or his desire for something which is in the amount of the moral debt, it becomes morally binding, whatever he says. It's not specific in any way. So he, by benefiting, by George benefiting Fred, he creates a moral debt in Fred, which George can decide should be paid up in a wide variety of ways. And when George says to Fred, I want you to pay up the debt by doing A, then he'll become obligated to do A. If he said B instead, it would be B. If he said C instead, it would be C. It means that George gets moral authority over Fred by what he did. Now, it's my contention that there are a number of such moral principles, not just one. And when we're talking about God's relationship to morality, this is what's going on. There are moral principles, and God acts in such a way as to qualify for the authority built into the moral principle. I just gave the example of gratitude. So let's say George saves Fred's life. That's very nice. What about the Creator who's giving you life moment by moment throughout your lifetime? And also preserving the natural world so that you can survive. And all the other benefits that you have, your education and your general health, and the amount of property that you have to be able to be used. If gratitude generates moral authority, then it'll be proportional to the size of the gift. Now, understand me well. Every benefit creates a moral obligation. I'm not saying that God takes over and he's the only one with moral authority. On the contrary, your parents have moral authority. Some of your teachers, who didn't just teach you because they were being paid, but because they cared about you and they invested in you. Some friends have moral authority. And God has moral authority. In quantity, God's moral authority is going to be much greater than any of those because he gives us much, much more. But the principle of authority is blind. The principle of gratitude is blind. To whomever a person owes for benefits received, that person has moral authority to determine what he should do. Yeah.
Rabbi, you had mentioned that the George, I think, the guy who saved Fred's life, that he can put limits on kind of what he owes Fred, like jumping off a building. He can't do that because that's outside the bounds of his moral debt. Right. So who decides those limits? Like, can George say, oh, I think painting your house purple is a terrible idea and I think that's immoral, therefore I'm not going to do that? Is that within his right to say, or who decides those limits?
I don't think we need a question of who decides. These are matters of judgment. And matters of judgment you discuss and debate, and you compare other cases like you do in everything in life. How much do I owe you? I think this is very common. If somebody does you a favor, most people, when somebody does you a favor, look for a way to pay it back automatically. Somebody gives you a birthday present. What's the first thing you do? You say thank you. And the second thing you do is you find out when his birthday is. Listen, I'm not a sink for charity. I'm not asking for support. It was very nice of you to think of me. And of course, since you thought of me, I'm going to think of you. Now, if he gives me a $25 gift, so I'm not going to give him a $50 gift. I'm not going to give him a $5 gift. I'll give him something because he did something and he benefited me in that way, and I'm looking for a way to pay it back. Mm-hmm. Should it be $23.95 or $25.06? The gray areas are legion. Almost every concept has black, white, and gray areas. The existence of gray areas does not stop discussion. It's not something that you have to settle as long as you keep your discussion in the black and white areas. So I'm not going to give you, I'm not going to nickel and dime it. But clearly, jumping off a building is something which is inappropriate to ask no matter what he did for you. And to paint you living room purple, if he saved your life, is clearly within the bounds of the get. So the debt. So as long as you stay within the clear boundaries, I think that there's no problem for discussion. Yeah.
I didn't quite understand. You said that the one extreme of it's moral because Hashem said it's moral. I'm not sure I understand the difficulty with that. I mean, if it's, say it's a law in the Torah, we don't understand it.
But that's different. In other words, if you're told that you don't understand, then you say, okay, then I'm not confronting something which I think is morally wrong. I'm just being told I don't understand what's going on. But what happens if it's something which I'm told what it says, and I'm told to do it, and in my book it's morally wrong? I want to know why or how. Let me follow this out. There's a little bit more that I can say. A little more that I can say about it. Because this is the popular position. This is in some of the books on Kiruv. Without God, there's no morality. So I'm going to leave aside the responsibility to prove without God there's no morality. That would make almost the whole of modern ethics just dead wrong in a way that a 6-year-old could figure out. That means hundreds of years of books written on morality are just making a 6-year-old mistake. Probably that's not correct. right? The people who are working in ethics and working in ethical systems and ethical judgments and ethical types of criteria, and you say, "Oh, you forgot! There's no God. It's all empty. It's all meaningless." Probably not. But I can make an argument on the positive side. So let's see. You're going to tell me without God there's no morality, and when God commands it, it becomes moral. He says do X, it becomes good to do, right to do, obligatory to do. And if he says don't do X, it becomes forbidden to do. Let's ask this question. What about God gets you from he said so to it's good and right? What quality of God guarantees that? What is it about God that enables you to say, God said so. So therefore, he said to do it, it's right because he said so. He said not to do it, it's wrong because he didn't say it. What are we thinking that what quality of God, what property of God is it that guarantees that transition? Is it that he's all powerful? Because he has unlimited power, therefore, when he says to do something, it becomes right. Might makes right. Do we say with people, the more power you have, the more moral authority you have? Doesn't seem correct. Just because you're very strong, therefore I'm morally bound to listen to you? That doesn't seem to be correct. Doesn't mean a connection between being strong, having lots of power, and therefore, when you tell me something to do, I'm morally bound to do it. Well, let's say he's omniscient, knows everything. Is it that, now I'm asking something a little prejudicial, is it that people who know more are automatically morally better? That they gain moral authority because they have lots of knowledge? Don't think so. I can think of some people whose education, I think, poisons them for moral knowledge, but I won't go into that. You can figure out who I mean on your own. Just because you know more, therefore, when you say something, it becomes right because you said so. So we're sort of struggling to figure out what is it about God that guarantees that when he says, give charity, he said so. So it's a good thing to do. When he says, don't steal, he said so. So it's wrong to steal. Is it because he's very powerful? No. Is it because he knows everything? No. Well, here's a suggestion, which I think is the only right suggestion, but then it kills the position. Maybe when he says it, because morally binding, because he's morally perfect. Maybe it's because he's morally perfect. Yeah, that would follow. Since he's morally perfect, when he tells me to do X, then doing X is going to be right. When he tells me not to do X, doing X is going to be wrong. But that kills the position, because the position was supposed to be until he gives a command, there is no morality. There is no right and wrong. There is no good and evil. He creates it by saying so or willing it so. Here, you've got to make the judgment that he's morally correct before you listen. According to the position we're considering, you can't make that judgment because you haven't got those concepts. You haven't got those rules. They come into existence when he commands. They come into existence when he wills it. Before that, they don't exist at all. So I think that describing why, when God says so, it becomes right, becomes a very difficult problem. What is it about God that I say, God said to do X, okay. Now what should I think about that? Oh, listen, God is Q. God is Q. Because he's Q, when he says to do X, doing X becomes right because he said so. What is that Q? I don't think we have a Q that can fulfill that criteria. Yeah.
So I thought maybe two ideas. One, you talked about moral authority. So by creating the world, he has moral authority, just as you talked about parent. And then Ramchal talks about how Hashem is ultimate kindness. So you could maybe say from the moral perspective of somebody who does things that are ultimately kind, ultimately selfless, therefore they're...
So you understand now, I answered that just now, that's not correct.
When you were saying that the morally perfect?
Well, kindness is another moral term, right? Kindness is another moral judgment that you have to make before you listen to him.
But we could extrapolate it out from...
But then I can only extrapolate it out as moral if I have a reason to listen to him to create morality.
So then could you say by creation that's the only the moral authority?
Well, I don't think creation works either. Let me give you a brutal example, okay? You heard of Lassie?
The
The dog, right? And I haven't told anybody about this, but I have a special ability. I can create Lassie at will. Bang! Here she is, sitting on the table. Out of nothing. I didn't borrow mass energy from the universe. I added new mass energy to the universe. Creation of my own. Can I torture her to death? Because I created her? I don't think so. So just being the creator doesn't give you that kind of morality. It doesn't give you that moral control or moral authority that you can do with it as you please just because you created it. Simply not right. Simply not right. So kindness isn't going to do it, because kindness means you're appealing to a moral quality that God has before you listen to him.
So that's you acting on Lassie. Isn't it? It's more like you created Lassie, therefore Lassie has to listen to you. Because you...
Why would it be different? If I can't do, if I'm bound, limited in what I can do to Lassie, even though I created her, why is it obvious that she has to listen to me because I created her?
You are not bound. I was merely speaking to the created and their obligation to the creator.
Again, we're talking about now whether if you create something, you have moral authority over it.
Yes.
Okay. Now, we are agreed, I hope, that one type of moral authority, the moral authority to torture until death, I don't have. So if that's true, then I don't have total moral authority. Okay, so then who says I have any? Now you'd have to divide and say, okay, this you don't have, but that you do have, and I have it for another reason. You'd have to give me a whole story. Just being creator doesn't give you moral authority.
Could we say that Hashem is a different class of that, where he has whatever, we can't limit his moral authority?
You can say the word, but you're not answering my question. My question was, God says do X. I'm supposed to conclude, aha, God said do X, therefore it's right to do X. I'm supposed to conclude that. And I want to know why. Why should I make that move from God said to do it to it's right to do? What quality of God, call it Q, what quality is I say, let's see, God said to do it. Okay, I've got it on record. Now what? Oh, God is Q. He's Q. Now I see. Because he's Q, therefore it's right to do. What's the Q? It can't be creator because I showed you that being created doesn't give you, right? It can't be all-powerful. That has nothing to do with what you say having moral force. It can't be all-knowing because it has nothing to do with what you say having moral force. And if you tell me it's because God is morally perfect, which your kindness is just a play-off on that, right? If you tell me because he's morally perfect, it's true that moral perfection is the right kind of quality. Yeah, God said to do X. Mm-hmm. And God's morally perfect. So, when he says to do X, it must be the right thing to do. That's a good move. But then, the point of the position was, until he gives you commands, there isn't any morality at all. The Dostoevsky words, right? So therefore, I can't say that he's morally perfect. The morally perfect has to come before I listen to him. And I'm being told that until he talks, there's no morality to use. There's no morality to deal with. So that means it doesn't help this position. It helps me answer the question, but in such a way that the position goes down the drain.
That you would need buy-in so that when the commands come, that you accept them as...
Which means you have to have morality before he talks.
Right.
Which means he's not creating morality when he talks. Right? I think that's the way to put the positive dilemma for that side. There's a negative dilemma also, but there's a positive dilemma for that side. Yeah, in the back.
Two questions. The one is what the Rav said. If morality is a concept given to us by God for us to function properly in a moral way, wouldn't the morality have to make sense with what we would determine to be moral? And therefore, if it goes beyond our own logic of morality, maybe we could question that morality, and then therefore someone could question whether God is moral himself. Like, for example, people question the Holocaust, and then they deny God because they say, how could God be moral? Because it goes beyond what we're going to call morality.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. And so does a very famous passage in the book of Genesis agree with you. That's to say, it agrees with your question, but not the answer you're looking for. Right? When God says to Abraham, I'm going to destroy the city of Sodom, cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? What does Abraham say to God? Are you going to destroy the wicked together with the righteous? Shall the judge of the earth not do justice? So Abraham says that to God. If I understand what you're proposing, I'm against it, and I'm going to accuse you of being a moral failure. That's exactly what he accuses him of doing. And it isn't as if Abraham gets the answer, go back to Philosophy 101. You just messed it up, Abraham. Go back to school. Right? I'm God! Hello! I can do what I please. No, sorry, that's not the answer that he gets.
Morality has to be, it's given for people that's within their sense of logic.
Not only that, but it binds him also. It binds him also. God says to Abraham, I'm going to do X, and Abraham says, you can't do that. You can't do that. And that's very good because I said it before, well, I emphasized, somebody said it. When you talk about gratitude, we talk about jumping off the roof, right? Gratitude does not require that you jump off of the roof. That's beyond the depth of gratitude. It's beyond the moral authority of the one who saved your life when he says, I want you to jump off the roof. So, quite right. And then I told you there are other principles, but all the principles have limits from which it will follow the question you asked. If there really are limits, that would mean you could set limits to what God can do. And the answer is, yes, we can. According to the Jewish tradition, we can. We can set limits. Because God operates according to these moral limits. So, okay, one more question, then I want to pull in one thing from the outside. Yeah.
I was wondering if the Rav could talk about how Abraham knew that human sacrifice was completely immoral. I think that's fair to say that Abraham believed that because he was following the Torah. The Torah says that it's okay, but then he believed sacrifice was immoral, but then God commands him to do. And if Abraham owes God a debt of gratitude, how is this not outside of those limits that we said Abraham could then establish, like jumping off a building? How is that not similar to the jumping off the building case? I know there's an angle. I'm just trying.
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. Usually when I teach this series, I go through the Akedah in detail. I don't know how to. I'll tell you a midrash, which should, first of all, open up the question for you. God tells Abraham, I want you to sacrifice Isaac. And he goes through it, and he takes the knife to kill him. And then God calls it off. Midrash records Abraham speaking to God afterwards. I had a very good objection against what you told me to do. I had a very good objection because you told me that Isaac will be your continuation. He'll carry your generations forward. When you told me to sacrifice him, he had no children. So it's a contradiction of what you told me. You told me on the one hand that he'll be my continuation. And you told me on the other hand that I should kill him. They can't both come true. So there's a contradiction in what you told me. And I could have raised the contradiction. And I could have raised the objection to you. And the commentators say it's a good contradiction. It's a real contradiction. And Abraham says, but I didn't, right? I had a good objection and I didn't raise it. So I'm asking you, God, in the future, when you have good objections against my children, don't you raise them either. Don't you raise them either. Just as I gave up on my objection against you, I want you to give up on your objections against them. That's a very profound midrash. And one of its profundities is what it doesn't say. It doesn't say what you said. It doesn't say, listen, I had a tremendous objection against you. This is immoral. It doesn't say that. The midrash is describing to us a valid objection that Abraham had against what God commanded him to do, and doesn't mention the question of the immorality of murder. What must the position of the midrash be? It must be that murder, in this case, isn't immoral. Otherwise, it would have said I had two objections. The only objection is a contradiction, but not murder. So somehow the midrash is not agreeing with your intuition that human sacrifice is when God commands it, is morally objectionable. I want to tell you something which will shock you, just to open your minds a little bit. The Maharal says that the best outcome would have been for it to have been carried out. The fact that it wasn't carried out is a failure, not on Abraham's part. It's a failure because in the social cultural context, it would be misunderstood, and the message that God wants to send would not be appreciated correctly, but it would have been a much better success if it had been carried out. So, you think, wow, that's challenging. In other words, to put it in epigrammatic form, when God commands A to kill B, it's not murder. When someone asks, how can God command murder? The answer is, he doesn't, because when he commands a killing, it's not murder. That has to be justified. But that's the headline for the answer. And the justification is this. God, I said this before, but I didn't stress it. God gives life continuously. You're not alive because you were alive yesterday and didn't die in between. You're alive moment by moment because God is giving life. Now I want to give you a very crude analogy. I don't know where you're from and how building codes work by you, but in Israel they work in a very interesting way. You're building a bunch of apartment houses, and they don't all get finished at the same time. And a person contracts, he's got to move into his apartment, and his house doesn't have electricity. What does he do? He strings a line from somebody else's house. I mean, they do it by agreement, and he takes the electricity from the other guy. Sometimes they pay, sometimes they don't pay, depends on how much it is, fine. So, Reuben's in his house, he has no electricity, and Shimon's one house over, and they string a line across, and Reuben is living off Shimon's electricity. That goes on for 4 months. One day, Shimon knocks on Reuben's door and says, listen, you're using my electricity, I want you to know, next week I have heavy machinery moving in, and I need all the electricity that I have for myself, so next week you'll have to find some other solution. Can Reuben say, you can't do that. You can't cut off my electricity. I'm living on your electricity. You can't cut it off. Shimon will say, why not? It's my electricity. I was giving it to you when it was convenient for me. It's not convenient for me anymore. And if you say, Reuben should say, well, listen, I've been thinking about it. All this time I've been relying on it. Now it's a shock. Imagine that every Friday there's a little letter in his post box. Remember, this is a gift, and it could end at any time. I'm not guaranteeing next week. He's been given indications always that this could end at any time. Does Reuben have any complaints against Shimon when he withdraws the electricity? I don't think so. Well, life is just like that. You're getting life moment by moment. Surely, when God says that your life is over, no complaints against God. He's telling you, I gave you a free gift. I'm not giving you any more free gift. All you can say is thank you for the free gift that you got. And if you say, but I became used to it and everything else, read the obituaries and you'll find out that doesn't go on forever. Everybody dies sooner or later. So, you can't have any complaints against God when you die. No. Does it make a difference how God arranges for your death? Let's see. Heart attack, okay. And kidney failure, okay. But not starvation. Or not, no, starvation I should have said. But not a brain aneurysm. He's giving you life. He's telling you, at this point, I'm not giving you any more free life. Since he's giving it, and it's a free gift, there's no complaints against God that life should end. I'm not talking about suffering now. I'm just talking about the ending of life. No, God says to Isaac, the free gift is over, and you're going to die because Abraham is going to sacrifice you. Where is the moral complaint here? Where is the injustice here? Where is the victimization here? I don't hear it. Certainly not murder. Whatever else you might imagine and construct imaginatively, it's certainly not murder. Murder means depriving another person of life, which, so to speak, is his. But when it comes to God, it's not his, not yours and mine. It's what he's giving you freely. I think that's a simple explanation as to why the Midrash doesn't take that to be the objection, because when God commands it, it's not murder. Yeah.
How can we say life is a free gift when we have certain commandments that we have to do and live by?
The answer is because, first of all, you didn't fulfill any commandments to deserve being created. You didn't get around to commandments till 13 years later. You got 13 years free investment, number one. And number two, the question will be whether the commandments that you fulfill really pay the debt. You feel that the gift of life is fully paid for and there's nothing left over, no gratitude left over because you follow the commandments? Most people think that the commandments that they follow doesn't come near to pay the debt of life.
Could you say that they're a condition of being able to continue to live? It's not like paying down the debt, it's just you're only allowed.
But that has nothing to do with the discussion, though. Yeah, in the back.
Couldn't the moral objection with Avram be his action as opposed to Yitzchak dying? Because yes, I hear if God constantly gives Yitzchak life, God can take it away. But for Avram to go and do an action, for me to go and do an action of killing somebody else, doesn't matter if maybe God wants that person to die at a certain point, but I cannot go and kill another person. That's me doing an action of killing.
Sure, but you're leaving out the key element in the story, and that is that God told Abraham to sacrifice him.
Even so, wouldn't that action be an immoral action?
Why? Now the burden's on you. Why is it immoral? That his dying, Isaac's dying, is not, and the command comes from the one who has the authority to end life. Where's the immorality?
What permission do I have to go and use my force to extinguish another human life? Isn't that act in itself an immoral action?
The question is why it's immoral. You're reversing the question, but I'm asking you to justify a judgment that there's some kind of crime here. Usually, when there's a crime means somebody is suffering in an unjust way, or someone did something to cause someone to suffer in an unjust way. Where is the crime here? God can decide when Isaac, his life is over, and God, since he's telling Abraham to end the life, which God is within his moral authority to determine should end, I don't see where the injustice is or the victimization is. Who's immorally losing out here? You're associating what Abraham's doing with other cases where it's not commanded. But in this case, it is commanded. Yeah, somebody else's hand was up. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, how does this answer of that if God commanded it, then therefore it's moral, how does that not contradict the second opinion that we had started off with, that morals do not originate from God to enforce, but that's not the answer?
So now,
I'm missing something.
okay, yeah, well, let's go back to what I said. I said we have a hybrid system, right? There are certain moral principles that are independent of God's command, and God's will, and so forth and so on, in a certain sense anyway. And then God does certain things, and because he does those things, he fits into those moral principles in a certain way, and that gives him a certain moral authority. So the example I gave was gratitude, right? The principle of gratitude, I want to just verify this idea that gratitude is independent. I'll do that before we quit today. There's a principle of gratitude, which means when someone benefits you, he gets moral authority to require from you a repayment that's within the bounds of the debt. Right? And God benefits us very greatly. And that being the case, when he tells us he wants us to do a certain thing, I should ask myself, given everything that he gives me and all the good that he does for me, is this within the debt? If it does, it becomes binding. By the way, so something also just to keep in mind, this means that the idea that there are ritual commandments versus moral commandments, I grew up on that in American Reform. You know, leather straps and leather boxes is a ritual. That has nothing to do with morality. Morality is giving charity and pursuing justice and so forth and so on. It's just rituals, not eating pigs and not going scuba diving on Saturdays. That's all rituals. That whole distinction collapses now, because that distinction forgets that we have a moral relationship to God. And if God, who gives me life and everything else, says I want a half hour every morning with leather straps and leather boxes, I think, let's see, okay, I'm alive because of him, and he wants a half hour with leather straps and leather boxes. Yeah, that's probably within the limits of the debt. and therefore I owe it to him, and therefore putting on tefillin becomes morally obligatory. That's one of the big surprises about this. So now, let me just add one more thing, because it will verify what I said before, and then tomorrow we'll review it. The Shimon Shkop in the Shara Yashar, this is 4th part, 2nd chapter, my oldest son showed me many years ago, asked the following question, similar to the Yuthafor question. We have a commandment not to steal other people's property. How does it work? Is it that God says, don't steal ABC? Under this condition, I'm sorry, I'm going to say it again. Don't take ABC. These things don't take. Okay, God told me not to take them, so it's wrong to take them, and that's why I shouldn't steal. It became stealing. It became wrong because God said don't take them. Is that the way it works? Or, says Rosh Shkop, one of the great Talmudists of the 20th century, is it that property is property? You know what property is. Property is an intuitive concept, which we all understand, and God says, don't steal other people's property. The property comes first, independently. God doesn't create property. He tells you, don't steal other people's property. Which one is it, he asks. And I'm sure that's the same chorus that would say God creates morality would say here, well, of course. God says don't take ABC. That makes it wrong to take ABC, and therefore that becomes stealing. But he says the opposite. Property is independent. And God says don't steal other people's property. And he gives the following analogy. Now here's the real, capstone. In our literature, the idea of gratitude is used as a reason for fulfilling the commandments, just as I have said 6 times this evening. Think of all the things that God has done to you, to you, for you, and he then says, I want you to do X, and you think, well, the enormous good that he's given me is such that I owe him, and that's a reason, not the only reason, but it's a reason for me to fulfill the commandments. Now ask this question. Where does the obligation to pay your debts of gratitude come from? That's the main principle you're leaning on. You're leaning on the idea I have to pay my debts of gratitude. Where does that principle come from? Hashem Shkop says, shall we say that principle is binding because God said so? Oh no, you better not. You better not. Otherwise, they'll send you back to logic 1, because that's called begging the question. Hooray! We started off with, here's God. Here are all the commandments, and I want to know, shall I pledge allegiance or not? I'm standing outside. I want to know, is there a reason for me to commit myself to this whole system? Along comes the philosopher and says, consider all the great things that God has done for you. Realize that you owe him an enormous amount, and that's a reason for committing yourself to the system. And then I think, okay, I hear you. There is a debt of gratitude here, but who says that I'm bound to pay my debts of gratitude? Who says that? And he says, oh, it's in the system. That's not going to work, because I'm standing outside the system. I want a reason to commit myself to the system. So the reason has to come from outside. If you tell me that the reason you're giving me, which is paying debts of gratitude, that itself gets its authority from the system, I end up with no reason. Says Shimon Shkop, the obligation to pay your debts of gratitude must be independent of the system, prior to the system, outside the system. So you can say to a person, God does all these things for you? Yes. Do you owe him a lot? Yes. Well, he wants you to do this. That's a reason for you to do this. And then you say, okay, I hear that. It's a reason, and therefore I commit myself to the system. It's got to be outside. It's got to be independent. Otherwise, it doesn't work. This, by the way, is where you find philosophy in our classical sources, which aren't dedicated to philosophy, but they were all superb philosophers, among other things. And you find it hidden here and there. Yeah, last question.
With the example you gave in Stone, that Avram said to God, how about the tzaddikim, what about them? So what is the takeaways that we can understand from this example about our relationship with God, with his logic and what right to do and unright to do? Because Avram indeed questioned his. So So I just don't understand what is the takeaway.
The takeaway is ask questions. But the takeaway also is realize of whom you're asking questions and that there may be answers that you can't understand, particularly because often the answer comes from a full knowledge of the past 300 years of history and the following 600 years of history. And if you saw all of that, you'd see why, of course, this is the correct thing to do. It's sort of like asking the question, if you knew this was Hitler in the baby carriage, would you kill him or not? Right? So of course, we don't know. We never know. But imagine someone did. He'd pull the trigger right away. You think he's a monster killing a baby. No, he knows a lot more than you know about what the consequences are. So there's always that way of saying that. This goes back to what I think he said. You can always say, I don't understand what I'm being told. I don't understand the significance of what I'm being told. And that's usually true. You don't understand the significance of what you're being told. So at that point, you have no solid objection. But the principle can be questioned, and often you get answers which explain to you some of the missing pieces, so you come to understand better. So it's always good to ask questions, but to conclude from, I asked a question, didn't get an answer, therefore this is wrong, that's a big jump. That's a big jump. If you did that, 3/4 of what we call science wouldn't exist, because 300 years later, you find out that the question was the wrong question, or it had an obvious answer, and just people didn't think of it. Yeah, last question.
I kind of have two, whatever we have time for. If we say that some moral principles necessarily have to come from outside the system independently, wouldn't that leave us with the problem of having things that are somehow extant independent of God? Like they're not there because God put them there, they're there on their own? And would that be a contradiction to our fundamental belief?
Good question, and the answer is that I only said it's independent of his commanding or willing it. I didn't say it was independent of his creating it. Those are separate things entirely. Commanding and willing could be a justification. I'll tell you why it's right. It's right because it has these and these features. That has nothing to do with creating it. The comparison here is mathematics. I hope you believe that 7 + 5 is 12. I hope you don't feel somehow compromised and undone by the fact that in no Jewish source will you find that principle that 7 + 5 is 12. So what's your authority for saying 7 + 5 is 12? Which Mishnah do you take it from? Which verse in Job do you take it from? Right? Sorry, I just know it, I don't need a Mishnah. I don't need a verse in Job. It's just God created me with a mind that knows this is true. So he created it and he created my mind, but the judgment is my judgment. It's not like knowing that you can't separate things out on Shabbos. That I need a halacha for. I need a revelation for that. These things you don't need that for. The Rambam says, the beginning of chapter 5 of the laws of tshuva, that God gave us the ability to know with our own thought and our own understanding what is right and wrong, at least moral rules. They can know it by that without being taught, without it being revealed by any prophet. You know on your own that these things are right or wrong. Of course, what you know is what he created, but you don't back it up by saying that he told me, or it's written here, or it's revealed there. You don't back it up that way. That's not how you justify it. You justify it because he gave you the intelligence to be able to understand it on your own. That's what's being said. Okay.